Oh, sorry.
Mr. Deputy President.
The Honourable Adam Searle.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. I was one of the committee members on this inquiry, and it is interesting to note, of course, that since this report has been provided, the government has now provided its response, and I'll address a number of the recommendations. Recommendation 1 was that the relevant minister, through the Council of Australian Government's Energy Council, seek to have information detailing the amount of gas available for purchase included in the National Gas Bulletin Board. And the second recommendation was that through the Council of Australian Government's Energy Council, the New South Wales Government seek to create the gas market equivalent of the national electricity market, and to undertake an audit of all regulatory tools available to New South Wales to improve transparency and openness in the gas market, both here and across Australia. And it's gratifying that the New South Wales Government response is to support those recommendations in principle. But when you look at the detail of the response, it seems to be limited to acting to cause the COAG Energy Council to direct the Australian Energy Market Commission to review the design, function and the roles of gas markets and gas transportation arrangements on the East Coast, as well as to look at the regulatory tools available to the New South Wales Government. And the New South Wales Government response doesn't enumerate those regulatory tools or set any particular timetable. It is noteworthy that on the 17th of September, the Chairman of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, Mr Rod Sims, also gave a significant address on the nature of what I will loosely term the gas market in this country. And he, in his address, he indicated that many aspects of the East Coast gas market are opaque and complicated, and this reflects the evidence that the committee received. And he makes these points: that the gas market is dominated by confidential bilateral contractual arrangements which make price discovery almost impossible. Trading markets are immature and illiquid, with conflicting views as to their utility, and at nearly all points along the value chain, the market is dominated by large players, be they producers and processors, pipeline operators or gas aggregators and retailers. And of course Mr Sims makes a number of other points. Michael West, the business columnist for the Sydney Morning Herald, also wrote in an article of the 12th of October, not only mentioning Mr Sims's address and agreeing with him, but making a number of salutary points, which is, while it's called a market, it really has all the hallmarks and features of a closed cartel. And this is why the committee, I think, found that there needed to be significant moves towards a more open and transparent trading of gas to make prices more reflective of market pressures, because there needs to be that level of discipline, and there hasn't been, because the industry had been characterised typically by a small number of producers, transporters and long-term contracts, whereas now the evidence before the committee was that the contracts being offered as they expired were of a shorter duration as well as higher prices. There does, of course, seem to be a debate about whether or not increasing production would actually put downward pressure on prices. That is the typical market theory, but again, the evidence received by the committee was that the nature of the industry was such that would not necessarily work, particularly if, given the advent of the potential for liquefying and then exporting gas produced in Australia offshore for the first time, whether with some producers potentially having the choice of selling domestically or selling internationally for higher prices, that this exposure to the international market would lead to significantly higher prices for domestic gas as well. And this would be the case irrespective of the level of supply. Mr Roberts in his article makes the point that, of course, a number of the gas projects in the pipeline, as it were, the Narrabri coal seam gas project and AGL's Gloucester project, if they came to fruition, would be amongst the most expensively produced gas in eastern Australia. And he propounded the notion that if this was the sort of gas supply increase that was on offer, further production of gas of this nature would not lead to prices going down, but would lead, in fact, to prices continuing to increase for gas. So these are all very significant matters for governments and regulators, both here and nationally, to consider as to what the best response is to the gas issue. I will address also the government's response to recommendation 3, which touches on the report of the chief scientist and engineer who gave her final report on the independent review of coal seam gas activities in New South Wales in September of 2014. And I note that the government, of course, claims to be implementing her recommendations and to be committed to them. And recommendation 3 of the committee report was that the New South Wales government fully implement the chief scientist's final report before any expansion of the coal seam gas industry in New South Wales is contemplated. It's very important, contemplated. Makes it quite clear that the view of the committee, except it was a majority view of the committee.
Yeah, just to make it a majority.
Oh, I acknowledge that interjection. Where is the government's response to recommendations 1 and 2 was to support in principle? The government's response to recommendation number 3, which I've just read out, was to simply support. But when you look at the details of what they mean by support, what they mean is, of course, the implementation and pursuit of their gas plan. And the gas plan seems to be premised on the notion that you can somehow continue to develop the coal seam gas industry in New South Wales while, and I presume in parallel, implementing the chief scientist's recommendations. That is simply not that was not the recommendation of the committee. The committee's recommendation was very clear that you basically had to press the pause button, implement the chief scientist's recommendations in full, which, if you look at them, and they're set out in the committee report, as well as, of course, in the chief scientist's own report, it recommends a very significant body of regulatory design and scientific and other administrative work to be done, which, if done properly and fully, would take, of course, some time. And it's notable in the government's response that they don't clearly set the time frames on where they're up to with the implementation of the chief scientist's recommendations. And, of course, they don't set out the resources they're committing to that project. Interestingly, the Lock the Gate group did a review and said that 8 of the 15 or 16 recommendations of the chief scientist had not been fully implemented by the government. But the fact is, I don't think any of them have been fully implemented. And I wouldn't expect all of them to be fully implemented because, as I've indicated, the work recommended by the chief scientist and engineer was very significant. I mean, to take but one example, the establishment of a whole of environment data repository to measure not just the individual impact of a project or set of projects, but the cumulative environmental impact of multiple land uses. A single legislative instrument to regulate and govern all extractive industries. Just looking at those 2 examples would give even the most casual observer a snapshot of the significance of the work that she says needs to be undertaken. But the government claims to be supportive not only of her report but of the committee's recommendation, which is to fully implement her recommendations before giving any consideration to the further development of the coal seam gas industry in New South Wales. And I can only assume that the people charged with developing the government's response didn't read the chief scientist's recommendations and certainly didn't really understand the significance of the committee's recommendations, because if the government's true position is to embrace recommendation 3 of the committee report, they will be joining with the Labor opposition and a number of the other parties represented in this chamber, because of course that recommendation 3 really does encapsulate the policy approach taken by a number of the parties in this place towards the issue of coal seam gas. and of course the opportunity to focus on that more fully will come when this chamber considers the coal seam gas moratorium bill being proposed by the opposition. Mr. Deputy President.